Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture, online at polarinertia.com, and by Press Up, friendly web consultants who listen to your goals and provide solutions that make sense, online at pressupinc.com. Many of the people who find your work today might find you, especially if they're in Los Angeles and fascinated by the city, by looking up the Bonaventure Hotel downtown, seeing what's the story with this place. They'll find a video of you on the BBC talking in the early 90s about the Bonaventure, about how confusing it is, and about the nature of the space inside. And you write about the Bonaventure in your new book as well. You include references to what you've written before about it. Tell me, is the Bonaventure still as fascinating to you as it ever was? It's fascinating to me, and kind of one of the saddest places in Los Angeles as well.
Well, it's still, I guess, fascinating in that it was. There's an historical significance, ironically, to it. It was a period when I was getting very much interested in postmodern critical thinking, and Frederick Jameson was one of the earliest people to make some comments about what I think he called it the Bonaventura. Yes. And sort of made a couple of mistakes, but it didn't matter. He was so prominent that when he started writing about it, I started becoming very interested, and a bunch of us that were getting involved in doing a lot of research on L.A. started meeting to see, this is one of the top cultural theorists actually talking about space in his critical thinking, and so this was exciting, and so I got involved. And then became fascinated by exactly what he was talking about, the kind of experience of the inner space of the Bonaventure being a place where you're almost destined to get lost and submit to authority in the sense of, please help me, I don't know where the hell I'm going this. And so that became fascinating, and I started writing about it myself. And I guess I was there recently. Last year there was a geography meetings in the Bonaventure, and
is it the same hotel you last saw when you were shooting? Or?
They have been making major efforts to somewhat humanize the Bonaventure. First outside, because when I started writing, it was truly brutal. The external skin of the Bonaventure was really horrible, concrete, stay away type of things. And they've broken that down and opened it up a little bit more. So the outside is fine. And the inside, they've tried to do something to distinguish, to give more landmarks inside. But it's still the same confusion because there are these four towers that are exactly the same. Yes. And if you go inside, the same thing happens. And I looked around for what we all wrote about that was sort of sounded most exaggerated, perhaps, was that there were several shops that had to close because nobody ever could get to them.
I believe that, though. They're still closed, it seems like. There's a lot of dead spaces in there.
And there's still a lot of dead spaces in there. So... and then what happened that was well known, I guess, is that the Open University in England did a big show on postmodern urbanism. And they sent a really first-rate BBC director over, and he did a film with me at the center of it, and did this interview, which I think is on Facebook now.
It's all over, yeah.
Yeah, where I'm on the balcony at the Bonaventure Hotel, and he was a wonderful editor, really was. So I sound much more sophisticated than I think I was at the time. But I remember it was on the edge of closing. And I started suggesting that perhaps it be used as a kind of museum to postmodernism, which, would have been an interesting possibility had it closed. But obviously, maybe the attention that it was given kept it going, because it's still, I don't know how much profit is there, but it still seems to be active. It looks really silly in downtown now. It looks tiny and tucked into a corner somewhere. But, it's still getting conventions, still working out. And So I looked for the same kinds of things. There's been lots of changes, but some of the same kinds of things are there.
Having just come back from London, I think to myself, my fantasy for the Bonaventure is maybe this is our Barbican, in the future. One of these buildings once so derided, they have a way of becoming beloved again, don't they?
Yes, I also stayed because I go to London sort of once every fall term, and a couple of years ago we stayed in the Barbican. But we stayed in a terrible place, so it didn't allow us to get into the popularity that it's achieving today. But it's a very different. The Barbican is an enormous housing complex. There's also another place we also stayed in that's going to escape my memory. A much smaller place that used to be considered a sort of brutal, horrible place that's been all renewed, and there's a Waitrose in the middle of it, and a film and a theater, and it is now very much in to live. God, I'm sorry, I forget, but
it's not coming to my mind either.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen for Bonaventure.
I see.
There's just nothing like that in downtown LA. Large-scale residential places that suddenly become in as residences. There isn't any kind of old residential area in downtown LA, so I don't think anything quite like those two. There's the one I'm trying to remember begins with an M, I think, but I can't remember it. But yes, the Barbican is well known for that.
This is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down in Mar Vista, far from the Bonaventure, with Edward Soja. He's well known in a number of ways. He's a distinguished professor emeritus of urban planning at UCLA. He is a planner geographer, or is it geographer planner? Which word do you use?
Geographer planner comes first. Yeah.
Geographer planner. He's the author of books like Seeking Spatial Justice, Postmodern Geographies, Thirdspace, and the new My Los Angeles, From Urban Restructuring to Regional Urbanism. When we're talking about Los Angeles, anybody's always talking about their Los Angeles, aren't they? It seems like this is a city where, when you say Los Angeles, you're always saying my Los Angeles implicitly. You're never saying the objective Los Angeles, are you?
Yeah, that's interesting. Although I didn't feel that much kinship when I chose to call it my Los Angeles, there is a degree to which you're right. I chose it that way because I purposely in this book wanted to talk about my own particular interpretations of LA rather than trying to sort of characterize the history or geography of LA in general terms. And so, but there is that. Part of it is because I think people have difficulty when asked simple questions like, do you like living in LA?
Which you have said you have no answer to that question.
I don't answer. I usually refuse to answer it. I say LA is fascinating, constantly fascinating. New things seem to be happening all the time. Changes are taking place rapidly and obviously before your eyes, and you get to see it very quickly and easily. But it's doesn't make you sort of enjoy life here. Again, there's smog in the air, there's crime, there's all kinds of other things, which is genuine, it's there. Los Angeles has this quality of having, of course, simultaneous utopian and dystopian features, as a number of people have written about it. So all the bad things that people say about LA are probably right. But they're mixed in with enormous numbers of very good and positive things about LA. And so it is difficult to say, do you like LA? All I know, I'm a New Yorker by birth and maybe by other things, but I can't imagine anyone in LA really and seriously, although I got a postcard like that, having I Heart LA as a bumper sticker.
Right.
It just wouldn't do that.
It's funny. I was just at a coffee shop very nearby recently, before I came over to do this interview, and at a table next to me were these 30-something ladies all it came up that one had lived in Queens, the other had also lived in Queens, the other lived in New York. So they started reminiscing about New York, but immediately complaining about the quality of the train stations and just sort of the sketchy types they would encounter. I'm sure they would complain equally about Los Angeles if you asked, what don't you like about Los Angeles? But I notice the flow seems to be, if not one way, mostly east-west, doesn't it, to this day?
I don't know about that. There's a very special interaction between New York City and L.A. The New Yorkers who live in L.A. Are of a certain kind of character. It seems most of the time, not everyone. And there's a constant public inferiority complex in L.A. about New York.
Directly about being inferior to New York in their minds.
Yeah, and that we must become more like New York, particularly downtown development and subway are both areas where you have now 75 years of LA dreaming about having a 24/7 downtown, being a world-class, which is so silly because it is a world-class city, but it dreams of becoming a world-class city only because of this feeling about New York, that it's not really New York yet, and so therefore it can't really be in that super world-class. And so there's this very complex relationship, which annoys the hell out of me because starting with some work I did years ago that I never really published on painting LA and LA art, discovering some remarkable things about artistic achievements in LA that are just forced into the shadow by the emphasis that is given to art in New York City. I mean, for example, the so-called Ashcan school that is given so much attention for being nitty-gritty, kind of politicized workers in dirty neighborhoods in L.A. There is a kind of similar political tradition in art in L.A., but it's bright and cheerful and it's got all kinds of color because of the sunshine. And because of the sunshine, it doesn't look as gray and dirty as the Ashcan school's depictions in New York. And therefore, it becomes it's just minor regional art. This is one of my favorite stories. I'm not even sure now if it's true. Is Siqueiros, one of the Mexican muralists who, like some of the others, deserves to be seen as a world famous artist on his own, not just a regional Mexican artist, muralist. But he did some murals here in L.A., including the famous one on Olvera Street that was whitewashed over and now the Getty has reproduced, I guess. And he left. He was forced out of the country, then eventually came back to New York City. And in New York City, the story is he invented, probably already back in L.A., the bulbous lettering that graffiti artists use. He was the first to use spray paint to paint. And the story goes, he taught drip painting to Jackson Pollock. And so, this was a major figure in Western art that gets relegated, and partly because of his politics, it gets forgotten, but gets relegated into a kind of regional muralist kind of tradition. And in urban studies in particular, in the way one interprets urban development in the United States, a kind of Eastern bias. And so our voices at first had to really be very hard, those of us who were working on Los Angeles, and assertive to sort of overcome the kind of biases that were so flagrant coming from the East. Just to give you some examples, the idea of spatial mismatch happening in terms of the urban restructuring going on, that black welfare-dependent black underclass was forming because they had no access to jobs. And this was part of the deindustrialization of America, and this was settling into national academic as well as political policy circles. And we said, what are you talking about? Well, even worse, post-industrialism. I talk about that a lot. That people started saying, oh, yes, this what's happening over the last 30, 40 years is the emergence of post-industrial society. And we're sitting here in L.A., the largest industrial complex in the United States, and said, what the hell are you talking about? How can you talk about post-industrial? And yet this was dominating the literature, and to some extent still does. What's happened in Detroit and in Los Angeles, in New York is post-industrial. And it has to do with the black welfare underclass emerging, and because they have no access to jobs that are suburbanizing. And in L.A., all of the studies that we've shown is jobs were next door to the main black area of L.A. It was pure racism that reduced the access. It wasn't physical, geographical kind of distances. And there was no welfare-dependent underclass. That was the problem. L.A. was where we invented the term, literally invented it, the working poor. Largely Latino, but that is the big problem in poverty that was being expanded with globalization and other economic changes, the new economy, was that large numbers of immigrant workers come in, get jobs, 2 jobs per family, 3, 4, 5 jobs per family, and still can't make a go of it in terms of poverty level. And so the term working poor basically starts in L.A. and starts moving eastward again as a major problem. But again, the Eastern biases were the ones that settle into Washington, into policy circles, into political circles, and we've had to really fight hard to sort of say that it's not just happening in L.A., but that the urban change through urban restructuring, urban change throughout the country is happening not in the way people in the East are interpreting it, but closer to how the people in the West are interpreting it. And so that's been a bit of a conflict over the years.
It's in line with a theme in the book, which is that some of these, not basic, but some of these strong qualities of Los Angeles go unnoticed for a long time, or we don't think about them in the right way. For example, you mentioned several times that Los Angeles is and has been since 1990 the most dense, or the densest urbanized area in America. It has been since, again, 1990, the densest urbanized area in America. Why does that surprise us?
Oh, because, among other things, in 1950 it was the least dense of the major American cities.
It happened so fast we didn't notice.
And really it happened, which is very typical of LA. Things happen extraordinarily rapidly that, and the rapidity makes it difficult to understand and interpret in the traditional ways, I guess, requiring more time to understand a New York or a Chicago. But in LA, they do happen so quickly. And of course, this created a stereotype of LA as a sprawling, low-density city, and it continued to dominate Eastern thought, which is another annoying part, continued to dominate Eastern thought until the present. It's still, when you talk about sprawl, of course it's L.A., and the idea is low-density sprawl, but L.A. has been densifying every year. There's also problems in L.A. I remember 20 years ago, 30 years ago, architects meeting and saying, well, what should we do? What kind of things should we do? And they say, well, we should start making more density. And I was saying, you don't need to do anything, architects. It's the density is happening. Because, as I said, as I'm saying in the book, which is the key new argument in the book, is that a kind of sea change in the very nature of urbanism is taking place. And a new kind of urbanization is emerging over these 30 years, and that needs to be recognized because we still put all of the new things we discover into the old baskets, and And that's not fitting anymore. And so we've got to be able to recognize this extraordinary transformation. It's not just the transformation from the least dense to the most dense. As I say, there are about 3 or 4 other absolutely radical turns on the heads that happened in LA. 30 or 40 years ago, it was the sort of maybe the most conservative city in terms of labor and the dominance of manufacturing corporations. Today, it's the leading center of the American labor movement. Much more than the Bay Area or even New York as a kind of innovative place in the labor movement. It was, in 1960, a classically WASP city, maybe more white Anglo-Saxon Protestant than any other big city in America. Today, it's one of the largest Catholic cities in the world, predominantly Catholic cities. It was the kind of stereotypic place for non-neighborhood kinds of activities. People created these sprawling networks and didn't even know who their neighbors were and isolated themselves. Now it's probably as active as a center of community organizing, community organizations, neighborhood groups, as any city in the country. It's flipped in 20 or 30 years. Producing a radically new Los Angeles since I've been here.
People didn't have the theory to grasp how a city could do that, and how a city could turn completely around in many different respects at once.
Right. And this is why I'm having some difficulty in convincing people about the arguments of regional urbanization, and the argument that there's been a kind of sea change, paradigm shift, or whatever you would call it, in the very nature of the urbanization process, and that all of us have been taught this, what I call the metropolitan model of the city. And it's so deeply ingrained that we think that this is forever. And what I'm saying is that metropolitan model is transforming. It's metamorphosizing. It's becoming something significantly different. Like this densification with LA, not the only place where this is happening, but perhaps the place where you see it most clearly, and it seems to be most advanced. This concept of regional organization versus metropolitan organization. The difference between city and suburb is almost non-existent in LA. Orange County, is it suburban or urban? I mean, Orange County is urban, in my view.
It's its own beast.
Yeah, it's a different kind of urbanism, but there are most areas there have more jobs than bedrooms. Right. You can't have suburbs that have more jobs than bedrooms. There's something else that's going on that doesn't fit the old categories.
So when Los Angeles densifies, we have found that does not make it into New York, and this surprises people.
Yeah, because it doesn't densify in sort of the extreme situation that New York and a lot of other cities do. Los Angeles missed out on the earliest phase of centralized urbanization in the 19th century. Because it grew so fast, so late in the 19th century and early 20th. It never experienced the centralization that occurred in New York City and Chicago and Baltimore and European cities and so on. And so it was always decentralized from the beginning, and was, I don't know if the word is doomed, maybe that's too strong, but it was destined not to have the same kind of downtowns as New York.
Because it started from other points as well that spread into each other, not just one outward.
Right. And so unlike the metropolitan model, which had a singular central city that had a dominant and dense core and went out, and then had sprawling suburbs, LA was a kind of networked city from the beginning. And this was a kind of different structure. Partly, again, the red cars have lots of interesting historical stories about it, but it's a different kind of density pattern. And so what happens, when I was reading about this, it still was stunning to me until I began to sort of notice the traffic on side streets in LA. The traffic on the freeways, that was always dense and, we were slow on the freeways. And then the major cross streets started getting slower. And now even the smaller cross streets are packed during much of the day. And that's where the density is, because the big difference is that LA adds 8 million people over the last 30 years. Doesn't expand in area very much. It fills in, and it doesn't create the housing that's necessary to house this massive increase in population.
Why doesn't it make the housing necessary?
It makes it necessary.
Why doesn't it construct the housing that is necessary?
I don't know. Right now, LA, and it has had for 20, 30 years, the most crowded housing in America, the biggest housing crisis in the United States. I sometimes argue that we have in LA a kind of, maybe postmodern, but a kind of hidden squatter settlement type. That houses perhaps maybe 700, 800,000 people, but you don't see it.
It's visible to the everyday explorer.
Yeah. It's visible at its peak in homelessness.
Right.
All right, so you have 100,000 people partly homeless during the year, largest homeless concentration in the United States. But then there are tens of, maybe hundreds of thousands of people living in backyard garages.
It was a new one to me to read that in your book. In backyard garages, are they just like renting these out under the table, or what's going on? Okay.
I mean, some of it is very fancy grandmother housing, in the backyard with very nice accommodations. But some of it is just a 2-car garage with curtains,
right?
And that's it, with 4 families.
Bare bones.
Yeah. Then the other thing that's fascinating, I mean, these are the reflections of this extraordinary housing crisis that exists here. There's some recognition of it, and there's some attempt to give some more money for housing from Washington, but it's the size of the crisis is so enormous. But the other thing is, you sort of drive around LA and you see hundreds and hundreds of these small hotels,
right,
and motels, and who uses them? Because you start seeing most of them have no vacancy signs on them.
You've never recommended them to anybody to stay in.
And what's going on? Right. Until you realize that there are, again, tens of thousands of people hotbedding. They can't afford first and last month's rent, and so they get together with 2 or 3 other families and they rent a room in a motel, and they share the bed in sequence.
And hotel owners know exactly what's going on with this.
Yes. I mean, they have somebody paying for the room. They don't care too much.
They're not going to ask questions. Yeah.
And these people are not criminals. These are genuine families, and this is all they can afford. And they can even feel altruistic that they're doing a favor, because otherwise these people would be on the street with the kids, because they can't live here. And so you started seeing all kinds of weird things. This is what we discovered years ago, and that have a kind of hidden homelessness or hidden housing crisis. That's even the story goes. I'm not sure if it's still true now, that the movie houses on Broadway downtown would close at midnight, particularly in the summer or hot months, and charge like a nickel for the homeless people to come in and sleep in an air-conditioned. And they just put on some terrible old movies, and that was it. And so there's...
I have heard stories of all-night triple bills that people would come and sometimes sleep through in the 1960s, thereabouts. So that sounds like a similar situation to me.
Yeah. So there may be a continuation of it. But it's... and part of it is really the survival techniques of the informal populations here, of the immigrant populations to survive in enormous numbers. I mean, I've heard estimates that 40% of the county population is working poor, at close to or below the poverty level. How does several million people we're talking about, how do they survive? And they survive with all kinds of brilliant, odd tactics that we sometimes don't even know about. Maybe they have to be invisible.
This is the type of thing you see, you find out about, you learn more about, you discover when you look at Los Angeles long and hard enough. Yeah. But tell me, when did you first realize that Los Angeles would provide this sort of endless fount of professional and personal interest for you?
Well, way back when we first started looking at L.A.
When was your first contact with Los Angeles?
I came here in 1972. And we didn't really do very much studying, except in the late 70s. I think I talk about it in the book. There was one of the early labor community coalitions developed called the Coalition to Stop Plant Closings. And this was an organization that was, responding to what the rest of the country was defining as change, and that was deindustrialization. We were seeing in L.A. some communities that were resembling very much Youngstown and Akron and some of the terrible places in the Midwest and the American manufacturing belt that were losing their factories and really declining into misery and poverty. And we were seeing that in certain areas of L.A., and this organization was trying to work with the workers in the factories to try to organize to stop the closings. Now, looking back, we realize that was futile effort. There's no way you were going to stop the corporations from moving to North Carolina or Singapore or wherever and closing the factories in L.A. But we started this organization. And the labor leaders asked us, what are we going to do? We want to organize on the shop floor, and we can't. Because the workers are saying, look, L.A. is booming, jobs are coming all over the place, we get 10 jobs. What they didn't say is that you needed 10 jobs to make the same amount of money as you were making in your one job. But we then started to look at L.A., and it was mind-boggling. All we knew were the stereotypes, and the first thing we found was that this was the largest manufacturing industrial city in the United States.
And that was somehow unknown before.
Totally unknown. It was unknown to us. Yes. It was unknown to everybody else. And we started studying this. I started studying this, and a bunch of other students of mine. And we realized it went back. It started in 1920. When Los Angeles led in that decade when they did a census. And then in 1930, it tied with Detroit. Everybody knows Detroit is industrializing. It's the great industrial boomtown of America. But Los Angeles beats it almost every decade for 50, 60 years. And so this was stunning. What did we hear from the East? Post-industrialism? And so this, very early on, we had this feeling that, my goodness, what a place this is. Because when we tried to answer what was happening in L.A., that's what the coalition asked us to do. We discovered that in the 1970s, the Los Angeles area added more jobs than it added people. 1,000,000-something, 300,000 jobs, and 1,200,000 people were added. It was the largest job machine in the world. We were getting very excited, yes. And probably too excited because we started maybe getting a little hyperbolic about L.A. But part of that was to we had to be assertive against the flow of ideas from the East. It was drowning everything. Biased visions of Los Angeles were dominating, and we were finding out all of these crazy things. That yes, there was a deindustrialization of significance, But that's because L.A. was the biggest Fordist industrial center west of the Mississippi. It was the second largest tire manufacturing center to Akron, the second largest automobile assembly plants to Detroit. It was this extraordinary complex that was dying in the rest of the country and died in south central Los Angeles. But at the same time, the new urbanization processes were happening in LA. New high technology, electronics, and all kinds of other things beginning to expand and explode in Los Angeles. Culture industries and other kinds of things. Computer-related kinds of industries. And that, this was also early on. We found, Alan Scott in geography and I and a couple of others, working on Orange County in particular, found that the high-tech employment in LA and Orange County together was already larger than the high-tech employment of Santa Clara County in Silicon Valley. At this time, Silicon Valley was getting all the attention for the new urbanization processes all over the world. And what we were seeing was something just as big happening here. We had all kinds of stories. Forbes magazine, the capitalist tool or whatever it calls itself, occasionally puts out maps of the hot spots in high technology industry. And in the 70s and early 80s, they put out their maps, Route 128 around Boston, Silicon Valley, Minneapolis, Phoenix, nothing outside of California. When we knew that this was at least the first, second, or third largest high-tech booming place in the country. LA was invisible. You can't have that in LA.
You can't have that. Why was it such a blind spot, despite the robustness and width of the activity in Los Angeles? Why the blind spot? Why did it get covered by so many blind spots?
Fascinating. It's a fascinating question. I think it's the intensity of the stereotype that suited the rest of the country. There's all kinds of things that relates to that, including football games on New Year's Day, nationally televised, when everybody is freezing, except it's 85 degrees in LA. It's nice to have a vision of this place as crazy, as stupid, as backward, and has all of these negative things to it.
Overgrown cowtown.
Yeah, and so it was a kind of convenient stereotype that kept L.A. incomprehensible, and made what happened in L.A. made us almost exaggerate too much to get heard. There was all my colleague, as I say, Alan Scott, a highly competent mathematical geographer as well as other skills, applies to the National Science Foundation to do a study of industrialization in Los Angeles. And he gets the referees' reports back, and one referee, a major economist, probably, we don't know the name, but said, Professor Scott is extremely competent. He knows his methods and economics. But why is he talking about industry in Los Angeles? It's like talking about coffee growing in Manhattan. There's no industry there.
What did they think was in the 500 square miles?
I don't know. Well, when they heard the industry, it's the movie industry.
Right. Of course, that's
Hollywood.
Still a current term.
Yeah. The degree to which Hollywood dominates the image of Los Angeles. Right. Is part of this issue. And so, in the East, Los Angeles, Hollywood, loopy people. And so it was very difficult to take it economically seriously. And to take what we were saying, and that is studying Los Angeles was giving us insights into understanding the dynamics of urban change everywhere, which was the heart of what we did. We were not that interested in we did at first, to dig into getting at some of the essential qualities of Los Angeles itself, But after a while, we just realized such stupendous qualities that we could learn about things happening everywhere. So the first major piece we did, we talked about a kind of combination model that in LA you could find Detroit and Phoenix and Sao Paulo and Singapore sort of all mixed together. If you searched, you can find everything here. That's why I titled something called "It All Comes Together in LA," and got criticized for exaggerating because people didn't realize that was the banner headline of the LA Times. It all comes together in the Times was accurate at the time because the Times was doing some very interesting investigative reporting on urban change. And so we were discovering all kinds of things. But as things developed, we began to realize that there was a kind of laboratory here for understanding urban dynamics all over the world. Which still, by the way, doesn't get easily comprehended. People, I don't know, in England say, how dare you say that you can see a comparison with Newcastle or whatever, when there's no Hollywood in Newcastle. How can you do this? Well, I've had that said to me about Scunthorpe.
Exactly that. Oh, my, I see. Now, this idea of how much one can find in Los Angeles, it brings to mind a name I was very glad to come across in my Los Angeles, the name of Jorge Luis Borges. And you reference one of my favorite concepts of his he used, which is the point that contains all other points. And how did that occur to you as a comparison for Los Angeles?
Probably the person that comes to mind is an old student of mine, an Italian student who had read it first and knew of my interest in spatial theory, and he suggested, I think it was Marco Cinzati, who teaches now in Berkeley, and I think he suggested I read the Aleph, and I did, and I started using it. He wasn't doing anything with it, but I found it was another way of conveying my arguments about space, my ontological, if you want, what I said before, arguments about space. That space was a kind of universal phenomenon, and he was a writer that was beginning to talk about the space that contains all other spaces. And then when I was doing a revision of my earlier work on Los Angeles, much more postmodern, I found almost all of Borges's work on the Aleph useful in describing what was happening in L.A.
Right, which he wrote in, the 30s, something like that? Yeah, of course, not thinking about Los Angeles, maybe thinking of Buenos Aires, but still.
Yeah, and I don't even know if he was thinking about Buenos Aires. He just goes into the cellar of a friend.
Yeah, certainly. It's just downstairs. Yes. The only city he would have been thinking, if he was thinking of a city, he would have been thinking of Buenos Aires, but this was just a point in the cellar.
Right. And by this time, Borges was being known as for his time concepts. And here was he talking about space. And that's what I seek out all the time in my life. That, going back to the first question with Jameson and the Bonaventure, Jameson became on my radar because of his discovery of space. And Borges was there for the same reason. And there's a little side story. The Italian student that I was mentioning also knew Umberto Eco. And he told me, this is when The Name of the Rose came out first in Italian and then in England, and then was coming to the U.S. and becoming very popular. So it's quite some time ago. And he said that Eco was actually sitting with his friends drinking, and he said, you know what, I think I can make a bestseller that's a philosophical text as well. And they said, no, you'll never be able to do it. And so the story goes, this was the origins of The Name of the Rose. And eventually, when it was translated, I started reading it. And after the first chapter, I went to my friend and I said, I know who the killer is going to be. And he said, how the hell you know that? And I said, it's going to be the librarian, the blind librarian. And why I knew it was that I knew Eco knew Borges. And Borges was blind.
Right.
And so the blind character was Borges, and I figured if he's going to make it Borges, he's going to make him the central person, the killer.
Yes.
And so I was, again, in this weird roundabout way, Borges came into that. There was a conference 5 or 6 years ago in Graz, Austria, on Borges in the social sciences. Just on Borges in different disciplines. And so I was representing sort of geography and spatial thinking, and there were people in cultural studies and mathematics or whatever. There were a couple of other odds and ends. In a way, it opened my work to some post-colonial studies and English literature and literary criticism. And I've been invited to conferences on literature and literary criticism all over the world these days. And but what I've discovered is very interesting, that they appreciate the fact that I've used literature in my work. But what I do is I use the literature to reinforce my other arguments. They turn it the other way in odd ways. They look at books to illustrate the larger arguments. So it's going the other direction. And so it was very weird, these conferences, because we seem to share something, but we're going in the opposite directions. For example, they say, I've got 5 Caribbean novels that illustrate the spatiality of social whatever. And how do I know? I haven't read these 5 Caribbean novels.
Sure.
And so they say, we use your work extensively. But it's in this peculiar kind of situation the other way around. If had I known maybe one of these novels, I would have used them to illustrate my spatial arguments. But I don't know that, because I haven't. So there's a kind of weird clash there around space. The spatial turn is happening, and everyone is interested in space, but sometimes for very different kinds of reasons, including this is religion, space, and the environment. The theologians are really into space these days.
Now, how do you keep spatial concepts from becoming too broad, from becoming unusably broad when you're talking about space, especially in Los Angeles, where it is a giant space with many types of spaces in it, some spaces astonishing, some less so. How do you narrow it down enough to use it?
Well, I don't narrow it down. My arguments are that we're all spatial beings from birth, and that we're always engaged in, if you want, this dialectic between trying to change the environment and the environment trying to shape you. Shaping the environment, being shaped by it, is something that is a constant, and is a subject that has been made invisible, like maybe that homeless population of LA. The most passionate work that I do has to do with trying to explain why the importance of space, being shown today in many areas, has been so totally neglected over the last 150 years. I make some arguments about the role of what I call social historicism, that historical thinking has blinkered us to spatial thinking, and that what I need to do is to free all of Western thought from the historicist narrowing, and that means opening up the spatial, rebalancing, not making the spatial substitute for the historical, but rebalancing spatial and historical analysis. The history, you ask me, and people say, but Soja, if everything is spatial, maybe nothing is spatial. And as I say, which is somewhat echoing a little bit of your question, but then I twist it around and say, you would never worry about anyone saying everything is historical. Everything that has ever existed has an interesting historical dimension to it.
Right.
And all I want is to people say, and spatial dimension.
Right.
That treating history and geography, or time and space, as equally important dimensions of reality, as it should have been and was before 1850, in my argument. And this is something that really hasn't. To me, it's the most important contribution I've made, and it's the one that has had maybe the fewest major followers. I mean, nobody is really picking up on this argument. I'm doing it in a new way now. I'm writing a weird book.
Sounds good already. And what can you tell us about the weird book, or the weirdness of the book?
Well, I didn't know whether to call it a quasi-novel or something, because part of it is a dramatization of hunters and gatherers 12,000 years ago, nomadic hunters and gatherers, deciding to settle down and create the first permanent urban settlements, some of which grow into the earliest cities before what happens in Sumeria and Lower Mesopotamia.
Pre-city.
So there's what I talked about in Post-Metropolis, there's two urban revolutions back then. One starts 12,000, 13,000 years ago, and the other one starts 6,000, 5,000 years ago. And there's a third one, which is the Industrial Revolution, happening after that. Each of them producing very different kinds of cities. The second one, which dominates the historian's mind, it produces the city-state, the state-centralized city. The first urban revolution that I talk about, done by these hunters and gatherers, produces cities that are not centralized. There's no state.
The earliest city then is more like Los Angeles than some cities.
Sprawling, but the big difference is that it's egalitarian. It's the most egalitarian society settlement that we've ever had, because after a short while, hierarchy begins to emerge in temples and priestly kinds of things, probably first. No state yet. State waits 6,000 years. But there's this internal evolution from extraordinary equality, and Çatalhöyük, which is what I write about, is the most equitable of them all. But now I discovered something much older than Çatalhöyük. I can't believe it. I don't have it here. A place called Göbekli Tepe. It's also in Anatolia in southern Turkey. And there's an ancient city there which the archaeologists have forgotten about, that I think is a generative force behind something that's like 20 Stonehenges, produced 12,500 years ago. Massive, circular, monumental things with brilliant carvings, done by hunting and gathering populations. There are no farmers, no farming done yet. These are the people who are domesticating plants and animals. They're Stone Age people for hundreds, tens of thousands of years. They've learned to work stone in brilliant ways that never has been imitated. And so I'm trying to capture both in terms of a kind of narrative interpretation, and then eventually in a kind of dramatization. With people and dialogue and exaggerating things, or not exaggerating, but introducing things that are not yet there in the academic literature, but are reasonable expectations. And so it's really exciting me, and I want to break open my time to get into it. And so it's a mix. It was going to be much more of a novel, and then I just can't control the more academic, analytical part. It's not that it's academic. I'm trying to make it easily comprehensible, but I've expanded a lot on the interpretations of existing literatures, which I think is necessary. And that out of that context, I'm going to tell this wild couple of stories, because it happens across in Çatalhöyük first, And then there's 1,000 years, and we have to talk about the peak of Çatalhöyük, about life in this city. So that's another dramatization. And so, because the time is a 6,000-year period, we're talking about the Neolithic. And so it's difficult to have the same characters in this throughout.
But it is still possible to discuss the spatial justice of a city that distant from us historically.
Yeah.
It seems like it had a great deal of that to begin with.
This was the most, I guess, spatially just city in the world.
And what makes a city spatially unjust? How does it go from just to unjust?
Well, that's partly, although I don't emblazon it with any interpretation, this is what I'm partly doing. And one of the first things that I deal with is gender inequality. Most people assume that hunting bands even they're egalitarian, but they had a gender division of labor. And I say that's probably not true. We have arguments and evidence that women hunted, men gathered and foraged, that there wasn't a gender division, that women ate the same thing, they were buried with the same trinkets, they were physically the same, they ate the same diet. There was no difference. But in my dramatization, what happens is that a bunch of people, of men, try to exclude women from stoneworking and architecture. That, I don't quite say it, but the Freemasons go back 12,000 years. And so what I have my lead female character fighting against this, saying we want equality, and we can't allow these characters to close off any activity for one gender. And so the first feminism and the first social movement against the stonemasons, because there is emerging inequality happening. And you start getting the shamans and priests that are associated with little temples that form, beginning to get more prestige and power, and beginning to build bigger houses, because one of the expressions of equality in Çatalhöyük is that there were 1,000 houses almost identical in its structural form, brilliantly differentiated internally, but externally exactly the same. Each one of them independent. They had almost no shared walls. So, and this first architecture too. They didn't have streets. They went through the roof. There's all kinds of interesting things going on. So I try to capture a bunch of this going on in dramatized form. For example, the lead archaeologist, Ian Hodder, for Çatalhöyük, spends a lot of time. He's a good spatial thinker, talking about how these largely nomadic hunters and gatherers coming in to live in a tight little house, this transforms their life. So that the geography of the building, they shape in brilliant ways, but it shapes them. And so that gets into my bigger arguments, how they shape the geography of the space that they live in, and how this confined space, which had to make people absolutely, claustrophobic, people who used to wander freely over nature, suddenly are settled permanently forever in these little tiny rooms. What does that mean? How does that happen? And so I try to sort of explain things like that in dramatic form rather than in analytical text.
Now, how does the way the use of space is changing in Los Angeles now compared to when you got here? How is that shaping us? The way Los Angeles space is in the 21st century and the 2010s versus the way it was in the early 70s when you got here?
Big question. I guess one of the things that pops into my mind reflects a lot of things that are on the minds of my students and colleagues in urban planning. And that is transit-oriented development.
Yes.
That there's a tremendous...
Some of them, like me, probably don't have a car, and so they really like when transit development goes up, because it's so cool. Now I can use that.
Right, of course. You don't have a car. You come here without a car.
Right, yeah. The bus goes here, goes down Venice. Yeah, that's cool.
Fantastic. Well, great. But there's a lot of attention being given to new bus stops, new train stops, and so on, to sort of prevent people from large distance journeys to work. And so I think that, it used to be, for example, we couldn't have a subway because we didn't have the density to sustain a subway. Now we have the density to sustain a lot of this public transit.
And wish we had more of a subway now.
And yeah, except I can be very sympathetic with the bus riders union for a variety of reasons. That there's a lot of stuff that can be done with buses that we still haven't exhausted.
I'll revise and say, wish we had more rapid transit now.
Yes. And I'll agree entirely with that. So that I think is one of the reflections. I think people, and I don't know of any studies like this, because I think that the increase in traffic and density has made people stay at home. They don't want to travel, and LA was a big, easy travel city. I think there's been a tremendous reduction. This may be reflected in delivery of food, shops and restaurants booming. There's a lot of unraveling that needs to be done about this, because for the most part, people still deny it. They can't quite realize that this is the densest urbanized area in the United States.
They still can't. Since 1990, it's been true, but still not quite accepting it.
And this doesn't mean that in my class, I start the class by saying, you're not going to pass this course unless you're able, in a very brief way, explain how this is possible. Because you're going to have it on a final exam, and you're going to have to answer it that way. And I do. I fail some students because it's so difficult. I mean, it has to do with all kinds of things. It has to do with outer city growth. So Los Angeles' suburbia is now urbanized, more so than, for example, New York suburbia. Washington is close. The Bay Area is getting close. That its surrounding suburban rings are densifying rapidly. Maryland and Virginia around Washington, D.C. But at the same time, also, the central city has lost maybe 1.5 million poor whites and blacks going to Simi Valley and places like that, but gained 6-7 million more immigrants. So parts of downtown LA are getting to be Manhattan densities. If you really look in detail, you find out that if you took 10% of the densest census tracts in New York and Los Angeles, maybe it's not 10, maybe it's 8. I forget exactly. Manhattan still is number 1. But L.A. is number 2, not Chicago or whatever. L.A. is the second densest. And once you get to 10% or 11% of the census tracts, Los Angeles catches up and stays ahead of New York, accumulating all the way across to the last census tract. It just has a denser outside the immediate core center of the city. And that's regional urbanization. That's the whole point of the argument. This is not the metropolitan model is one with steep density and sprawling suburbia going outward and suburbs growing in these multiple rings. And that's how the city grows. So that city doesn't grow that way anymore. And Los Angeles is growing in a very different way. And the other part of it is we still need a hell of a lot of work. Because I've just come up with this argument about regional urbanization in this last book. There's a little bit of it in Post-Metropolis, but I'm very cautious about it. Now I'm convinced that I'm right, that there's this new kind of process emerging. And there's like 50 or 60 terms that have accumulated since the 70s. Because people have been noticing this a long time. Something is happening in suburbia.
But they couldn't get their minds around it or terms around it.
Right. And so each person would make up new words for it. Metroburbia, post-suburbia, urban villages. Yes. Even, what was the famous one, idiot one? It was pepperoni pizza cities.
I've never heard that one.
Yeah, with little globs of pepperoni around.
I can envision it, certainly.
Yeah. And the ones who understand it best are the Chinese, I think, because they have an official category called extended regional urbanization, and they're trying to develop these super agencies to do some work on city regions of 120 million people. The biggest, now we have a new language of regions that's happening separately. Mega regions, megalopolitan regions, all kinds of new words coming out because we're suddenly seeing the world is regionalizing. And the metropolis is regionalizing, and everything else is regionalizing. And so there's a new regionalism. I've always considered myself more of a regionalist than an urbanist. And that's why when I look at Los Angeles, it's usually big picture Los Angeles rather than detailed local studies like Wilkie and a number of others who do intensive studies, which I think are great, but there's like 5 million stories that you could choose in LA, which there's so many fascinating spaces and places that you can keep on going forever doing intensive local studies. But I'm saying we really need that larger scale framework, and that's what I'm interested in. Larger scale interpretive frameworks. I mean, the most interesting recent thing, I don't know, didn't see whether you had done anything about it, but over the last 8 or 10 years, the thing that's unbelievable to me is the emergence of a suburban Chinatown.
Oh, yes, what you mentioned over in the San Gabriel Valley, where I'd love to eat there, certainly. There's plenty of great food.
Stunning.
Yes.
I mean, there weren't very many Chinese in L.A. 30 years ago or 20 years ago. And the initial growth here was from Taipei, but now it's mixed Chinese, mainland Chinese everywhere. And it's spread throughout the entire San Gabriel Valley from, what's it called? The city.
Monterey Park?
Monterey Park, yeah. And that's a story in itself. That's been studied for a long while because it was a famous meeting place for Anglos, Latinos, and Chinese. Did you know one of the only places where there was a kind of Anglo-Latino alliance? And it revolved around making English the official language of Monterey Park. That's wild. Yeah. And it's interesting because the Chinese scholars are saying this move into the rest of the San Gabriel Valley in part arose from the restrictions against the Chinese in Monterey Park. Even though they became the majority and became the mayor and the city council was predominantly Chinese, the aggressiveness of the local Latino and Anglo populations made them feel uncomfortable, and so this stimulated this growth throughout the whole San Gabriel Valley. I don't know how true that is, but it's an interesting idea that builds upon the literature on Monterey Park, which is quite rich.
This is the kind of process you can learn more about. You can understand better, listeners, if you read the book by my guest today, My Los Angeles, From Urban Restructuring to Regional Urbanism. My guest, by the way, Edward Soja, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Urban Planning at UCLA. Edward, thanks so much.
Great. Thank you very much. I enjoyed the talk.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kodlubowski, Peter Kavanaugh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Traher, Thomas Interberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, Dion Wolf, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.